What's up, world? It's Willy What If here with another episode on what if Deku gave up on being a hero. Let me know how you're enjoying this series, or if you have any suggestions on what you want to see. And enjoy the video. Part 3. Stale coffee and cheap donuts were some of her favorite things. They smelled like freedom and progress made real, and despite the nagging wish that some blood had been put in the brew, she still enjoyed the small compliments. The brunette sitting in front of her was another story. Together they sat in a white concrete basement of the local Addicts Anonymous building with nothing except the two of them. A table of cheap pastries and bad coffee with a poster advocating villain reform program stuck above the stairs that were illuminated by the bright LEDs lights hanging from the ceiling. So tell me the usual stuff, Miko. And quat. Uraka said with as hard a face as her puffy head could make while she crossed her arms. I got all my work done for my job this week, went to my therapist last Tuesday, made extra sure I had at least 3 months surplus of sanguine and took the SD pills. Same old as always. Uraka kept the stone-like expression, handling a sheet of paper from a file that Himiko knew was from her being protective. The heroine handed the item over and spoke with an edge to her voice. I looked up this guy like you asked, and he is hired by the Sugarman Agency as its only sidekick along with a job at some consulting firm. Everything about him seems plain, right down to the fact that he's quirkless. And quat. And that's a problem? And quat. The ire in the heroines did not lessen at all from that, still shanking the former villain with an iron-hot glare. That's almost cliché for someone who wants to keep something hidden. He just shows up out of the blue, drunk off his ass, and somehow manages to meet you at the exact right time, while also having no noticeable history at all, criminal or otherwise. For all intents and purposes, Izuku Midoriya may as well not even exist in the world, if that even is his real name. And quat. Or maybe he's just some random normal guy so I managed to bump into on a very dark night? Trust me here, cheeky, I know dangerous, and he certainly is an apostrophe T. And quat. But you don't give off those vibes immediately either, and you did a whole lot of stuff. This guy could be anyone and you just immediately accept him into your life? How do you know he isn't in some weird fetish cult or knows who you are? And quat. Himiko gave the most flatlined look she could give, topped off by a lifetime of hardship that showed throughout her still somehow beautiful face. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Wouldn't be like it's something that we haven't faced before. Besides, it's not like I have anything romantic in mind for this guy, even my version of romantic. And quat. He's just some schmuck that I'm helping out since I have nothing better to do. And quat. A padded finger was pointed at her, but slowly retracted as a wave of emotional exhaustion rolled over the more upstanding woman. Look, Miko, I understand that you're looking for someone to just be friends with at the least, and ever since your release you've been nothing but upstanding, which means you can keep going in life. It's just you have the worst luck with attracting people. For the past 10 times in 10 years you managed to become entangled with some of the worst kinds of people, and it's a miracle you get away with your chastity intact, much less your physical safety. It's just I don't want you to fall into the same trap you keep getting yourself into. And quat. Himiko pursed her lips with her eyes slightly going to the side. I know what you mean, and you do have a valid point to be worried about given my track record. It's just, is it messed up that when he offered to make another trip outside to get me blood, I thought he was like that one guy who offered to kill people for me to drink when he obviously meant going out to buy blood packs? And quat. No, it shows you've been through a lot and noticed stuff that most don't. T. And quat. The hero sighed at the room itself, not at the woman who thrice times attempted to end her life. Rather, it was the steel clamp around all their necks since the Meta Liberation War began and ended, taking with it much of what was left of their innocence while the survivors tried to piece together their lives. Himiko, I believe in you, I really do, but it's the sheer fact you attract the worst kinds of people by accident that makes it hard to swallow. I might be completely wrong about this guy. For your sake I hope I am, because I think you legitimately deserve some happiness in your life, but the longest you've ever been in a relationship was 2 months, and that girl was a literal sociopath who wanted you to kill people for sport because it aroused her to watch them die. And quat. The former villainess shivered at the memory. Sure, she was alike to that woman at one point, but it came from a place of love, twisted, sick love, but love nonetheless. Her approach to it was so removed that even if they had met in their teens, Himiko would be turned off by that monster's view of death and the hunt. She was sure even Tomura and Dabi would have been disgusted if they were still upright. I know, I keep fucking up with people, but at least this guy tries to act right. Hell, he's the most self-disciplined person I ever met. Sure, he's a fuck up, but he has potential to grow. The only thing off about him that I can really see is that he harbors a lot of repressed emotions. But who doesn't at this point? And quat. Concern colored Uraka's being when she leaned forward in what might have been an attempt at a comforting pose. Hesitation lingered as if it hurt to suggest. This guy, he isn't prone to outbursts, is he? Because I had to deal with a lot of that from Bakugo back in high school. I understand how tough that can be. And quat. An eye roll answered her. Oh please, if I came across a fucker like that I would have broken his ribs. And quat. A sad light shone in the brunette's eyes. The sort of sorrow only the scars of the past can make, as she almost appeared to be looking at something far away. No, not like that where it's anger, That's easy enough to manage. I mean like a full-on emotional meltdown due to stuff in his past. And quote. She bit her lip as memories of what was her first and only relationship thus far came back. Katsuki was complicated. He was emotionally stunted in his childhood, so he had the tendency to bottle them up. With him, the one emotion he was always used to releasing was anger, since that was the one that wouldn't get him completely berated at home. All the others came out in very sporadic ways that might have him laughing on the floor after a gag in a film or sobbing uncontrollably when we hugged. It was so emotionally draining at times, and it wasn't even his fault. Hell, he threatened to kill somebody one time for flipping me off. And quote. Disdain was the single response on the former murderer's face when she heard that drivel about the man who hurt her family. So hothead has bipolar, big fucking deal. I'm used to dealing with emotionally disturbed individuals, thank you very much, and Greenie doesn't seem that bothered in the head. And quote. Now Uraka raised an eyebrow. You've given him a pet name ? And quote. Himiko glared at the woman who helped so much. She was an angel, but by God could she be annoying at times. I do that with everybody. He just happens to have a mop of green hair with green eyes, so the name stuck. He's just an acquaintance at most. And quote. She paused, re-evaluating her words suddenly when memories of nearly a month showed up. Okay, so maybe he's a distant friend at best, but still, it isn't like I want to jump his bones. And quote. There came a far more parental edge to the anti-gravity user, staring at her like a kind yet stern sister. Himiko, I know that look. You two did something, now out with it. And quote. The ex-slasher felt the rush of warmth to her face, which could only be from embarrassment as she avoided the judgment leveled against her. Well, we've been sparring in martial arts since the idiot never took a class in his life, and admittedly it does give me a bit of a thrill to beat him and watch him squirm. I'll admit that. It's been fun watching him get better and seeing him get angry and then incredibly happy. Heck, I find the way he looks when he is scared to be something worth remembering, except he isn't horrified of me despite how rough I am or too into it. It's just a training session and that's it. And quote. Crossed arms greeted her like a stone wall. You're smiling. That means you did more than just spar. What is it ? And quote. Himiko pursed her lips once again and began to twiddle her thumbs, knowing damn well what was coming. See, during a sparring match I may have said something to zone him out. And quote. Which was ? And quote. A long pause hung in the air as Himiko kept her head down in shame. I asked if he wanted to suck on my titties because he's a flustered guy and I may, no I did, stick my hand down his pants and twist his balls because I wanted to show him what to avoid. Afterwards, I forced him to cuddle for payment and we did that for a few hours. Then we both fell asleep on top of each other. And quote. There it was, the sign that said I'm not angry, just disappointed. And quote. Clasping her hands together almost as in prayer, Uraka gave that tired, everything is gonna be alright smile. Himiko, I think he might be taking advantage of your situation. It's clear you're lonely, anybody can see that, but this guy may be trying to use you. And quote. Anger boiled deep inside the blonde as she snarled with her teeth bared, not making the heroine back down an inch. He didn't do anything. I was the one making the choices here, he just went along with it. I approached him, I kept kicking his ass into gear. I'm the one making sure he's on track. I'm the one pulling the strings, Missy, not the other way around. I am nobody's subject or plaything, least of all a loser like him! And quote. A hand touched her fist, gripping it lightly as the physical contact seemed almost to drain away the anger and anxiety from the blonde. Uraka looked at her sympathetically as only someone who knew exactly what she was going through would. Miko, I love you like family, you know that, and perhaps I am being paranoid. It's just you latch on so hard to people that you tend to overlook things. You have a habit of sacrificing a lot for people and, I guess I want to know why you're bothering with this in the first place. And quote. Himiko grasped the hand in return. Why was she doing this? He wasn't anything special or remarkable. If anything, he was a dead weight on her. But that's the thing about being at rock bottom. The weight doesn't bother anymore. Sure, he appeared like a good guy and at least he isn't horrified by her requirements for blood or overly obsessed with it. He was a plain, normal accepting guy with a chip on his shoulder. Her heart didn't skip a beat, nor did she really want to cut him. So she wasn't in love. He wasn't exactly someone she admired either, like Stain or Uraka, since he never really did anything worthy of her admiration. So he wasn't cool. He wasn't particularly wealthy and had even less connections than her, so it wasn't for survival or money. Yet, he was there. He hadn't run away when she went so far as to put a fucking knife to his throat to make a point. He didn't cringe at her needing to drink blood. He hadn't asked to fuck or do anything obscene. He wasn't weird in a perverted way, and he at least came by to visit every week and they could at least joke around. How long had it been since she had an actual friend? Not a well-meaning parole officer she owed everything to, not a self-righteous hanger-on who thought they could fix her, not a mentally disturbed pervert who wanted to debase themselves with her body and knives. A friend. Just a person she could unwind with and talk about stupid shit and go to concerts or watch shitty movies with or share a meal with. Somebody who she didn't need to be Himiko Ito, the reformed villain, or known as Himiko Toga, the sadistic killer, and instead just be Himiko, the 20-something with a completely fucked life who has no family and loves bad TV. The last time she ever had that was in her teens and she was too mentally far gone to really appreciate it. All those people were dead. She was the only one left standing by only a thread and it could be snapped at any second. She needed personal connections. She needed someone to just be there because it was hard being alone. It sucked being alone and knowing the whole world would hang you if they ever found out who you are. Pursing her lips and sucking her fangs, she shrugged as the hand was withdrawn. Because I'm lonely and he's the best thing I can get at this point. I don't love him or anything, but he shows up and doesn't freak me out or disgust me, so that's good enough. I don't know where my life will go, and if something were to happen to you, Cheeky, then I'd be screwed. I don't have the league anymore. I never had my parents and everybody else wanted to use me for something. So in the whole heap of shit, he's the one that stinks the least. And quad. Uraka put a hand on her shoulder, giving a melancholy smile like one seeing a terminal patient. I see. Well, you can always call me if things get bad. And quad. The blonde smiled back at her, assured by the statement. Himiko knew she had no right to the life she lived, even if she had eventually repented for those lives taken. Her actions were too horrid, but still she went on even after the world left her. Jin was gone, Tomura was gone, Toya was gone, Magna had been taken too soon, Iguchi was gone, Kurogiri was gone, even Sako had been slain, leaving her alone in this horrible world without anyone. Maybe she deserved it for what she did, but part of her owed it to them to push on. Her villain days were done. She could still pull off the moves and still possess the skills and knowledge to easily be and B-rank villain, especially with the experience afforded to her. But even if she still futilely wanted to change the whole world after learning firsthand the consequences it would bring, she had a feeling deep in her soul that if she perished that way, then her friends would weep in the hereafter. All that was left was to chip away at the days she had and try to enjoy them the best she could while keeping her nose clean. So if this guy was to be a part of it for even just a little while, then she'd accept it, and at the very least she had her savior to fall back on if it did go south. Thanks, Cheeky. And quad. So one thing has been made recently apparent to him. One thing, which was the equivalent of giving an alcoholic the keys to a brewery. Izuku Midoriya now had unlimited access to the National Quirk Registry of Japan, thanks to his status as an official in the hero industry. Words cannot describe the amount of overwhelming sense of amazement at the millions of quirk on file, to the point his heart skipped a beat when he logged on to the website. This was every dream he had about analyzing the powers of the people around him expanded by 1,000 times. There were psychological profiles, noted biological requirements, video evidence of the quirks in use, and so much more. It was more than his amateur notebooks could ever hold. However, he needed to retain his discipline and sort through these things like numbers on a screen. His culprit was at least using a quirk that produced a bright flash or was being subjected to one. Thus it narrowed the possibility down by a small margin of what it could be. Still, every quirk on record right at his fingertips was beyond breathtaking. Starting off his search, he typed in the keyword flash followed by light, then transportation in separate windows. That each pulled up thousands of quirks, which simultaneously made him frustrated and giddy. His dive into the information would be interrupted just as soon as it started by the smell of roasted coffee wafting into the room. Looking up, he couldn't help but glare as a small mug was placed at his desk by an overly sweaty Rikido, who also held a mug of bean juice. Are you making heads or tails of that mess yet? ? And quad. Izuku took the cup and sipped some of the brew, grimacing at the taste, but drinking it anyway. Seems like the coffee budget suffered as well. No, it's a fantastic resource, yet since I can't pinpoint a name for the quirk, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack the size of a town. And quad. Resignation rolled off the pro hero's chiseled features when he tapped his sidekick on the shoulder. I know exactly what you mean. That database has been used for so long that there's people from 3 generations ago still on it. I think you've been working for too long now, so flip that thing off and come spar with me for a bit. And quad. Professional disdain shone through when Izuku glared at the giant. Don't you want this solved? ? And quad. Brown eyes regarded him softly, almost with a twinge of guilt. Yeah, but that can't happen if you burn out, and so far you've been working nonstop on this in your personal time while having to juggle your desk job. So take a break for a couple hours and relax. Maybe it'll even get your mind working better. And quad. Izuku scoffed at the suggestion, waving the hero away and curling his back closer to the screen with a blank notebook placed to the side. There's only so many hours in a day, and human beings can go beyond their natural limits if they push. We have a lot riding on this, so while I appreciate your concern, leave me to do my half of the job and I'll leave you to do the leg work for now. And quad. Those hazel eyes narrowed at him before closing with a sigh. You either take a 2-hour break or I'm sending you home. What you're doing is violating the labor laws, mophead, and I can't abide if you're actively breaking a law like that. And quad. Green eyes met the hero filled with a deep resentment. How dare he try to remove the only person who could or was willing to aid in such a case. His hands were practically full from his duties to the public, and every day the agency slipped further and further into obscurity due to their standing within the rankings. Didn't he realize this was his own livelihood dying a slow death? That the situation which allowed a quirkless man to at least cling to the edge of official heroism was in threat of fading before it even passed 2 months? Everything was riding on this, which meant it was depending on Izuku. This was the one opportunity to prove that Deku was dead and that what everyone, even his mother, said was wrong. They had what could only be a stare down for an uncomfortable amount of seconds, yet Izuku soon sighed, shut off his computer and ran a hand over his face and stared at his reflection. There were heavy purple bags under his eyes and the beginnings of green stubble around his chin. Had he really been pushing himself too much? Briefly he chuckled as the image of the crazy girl comparing how shitty they looked came to mind. God, he must have let his sleep get away from him if he's starting to look as bad as her. He shook his head and looked at his employer after standing up from the desk and sipping the coffee. Sato, be honest with me, how badly do we actually need this case solved? Because I think I can eventually figure it out and I'm more than willing to go beyond with pulling my weight, but I think I do need to step away for a bit. And quad. Relief played out from the sugar hero as he watched his sidekick literally decompress by taking a seat on the office sofa and relaxed his usually tense posture. He walked over to an orange container set next to the coffee machine and withdrew a candy bar for himself, feeling caught between pride and guilt for how hard his employee was pushing. Honestly, not very much. This is an E-ranked issue at best, something only a hair above what the police are equipped to handle, and that's because the guy keeps slipping away. Nobody's life is at stake and it isn't a matter of public safety, so it'd just serve as a marker for a bump up in the ranking. And quad. Unwrapping the treat he took a bite, sampling the fluffy nougat mixing with caramel over the milk chocolate shell before continuing. But those come constantly if you do enough. My problem is that I tend to stick to my beat and most people in the area know me well enough that even the crooks tend to not cause a ruckus if they're local. So no major outbreaks of violence or gang activity, which is good of course, but leaves me floating in the drink. And quad. Izuku raised an eyebrow at that, gesturing for one of the candies to be thrown his way, which it was. Wait, so you don't fight actual villains? And quad. Rikido shrugged, leaning back against a wall and bit down again on the sweet. If by villains you mean bastards like the League, Stain or the Yakuza, then no. My usual day involves breaking up street fights, stopping shoplifters, and attacking muggers. Small fry incidences made by people either down on their luck or just stupid that don't net you fame and attention like the top 50. Frankly, I don't envy them either, having to deal with problems that big mess up your head and paint a target on your back. And quad. Confusion was all that remained on the quirkless man's face as he consumed the thin bar of chocolate. So if that's the case, then what makes you any different from a cop? Sure, you do help people and you do make a difference, but why would the government be willing to spend the extra funding to afford you this place? And quad. A thumb was pointed at a torn yellow suit of spandex framed on the wall with a news article under it depicting Rikido holding up a wounded man. Because they aren't paying to stop crime, they're paying to have symbols of authority and hope walking the street so people can pretend everything's alright. If I was wearing a government-issued uniform and had a star pinned to my chest, then I'd just be another faceless drone of federal authority, and while the police do good things, it's too impersonal. The main reason cops can't use their quirks like heroes can is because it creates the image of an authoritarian state by saying we can do whatever we want because we have an army of superpowered stormtroopers. And quad. Which may have flown back in the pre-emergence days, but since the individual is afforded way more power in a way that can't be controlled or restrained in the same way as weapons, then the government had to allow an outlet for that power or face the wrath of their citizens. And quad. He tapped himself in the chest with his thumb. In a nutshell, heroes like me serve as a reminder that people can use their talents for good and that their individuality doesn't have to be forfeit in the process, which is why most pick to be heroes rather than cops. And quad. So we're essentially a sideshow? And quad. Water dribbled down Rikido's chin as he managed to drain a bottle. Yep, that's what part of the hero industry is ever since it went official back in the golden age. It lets people live out their escapism and produce better role models for the world. Hell, that's why so many heroes had product deals before the war. It was a living segment of entertainment, law enforcement and celebrity all rolled into one. Even today you need a certain marketability to be really big. And quad. Izuku mused on this for a bit then shrugged. It was true. Heck, he knew it because he was once a prime demographic for that with how much he spent on All Might March. Still, he wondered if things would be like that for him one day. Probably not. So what now? Do you mind if I just sit here for a spell? Because I'm down to train, but I kinda wanna just chat. And quad. Sitting himself down in his chair, the Sugar Rush user kicked his feet up on his desk and fished out a pamphlet from a drawer entitled 5-Minute Bakery. And quad. Knock yourself out, dude. Not like there's much to do anyhow. And quad. Silence reigned for a minute or two with neither of the men sure of what to say. Izuku curled his fingers and allowed the knuckles to pop as ideas formed in his head, some more outlandish than others. Can I talk about the case? And quad. I wouldn't. You put too much effort into one thing in your head and you lose balance mentally. Besides, you spend almost every second working yourself to death at that desk job you got or burning your eyes doing work for me, which I greatly appreciate. Don't you have anything going in your life? And quat. Another candy bar was thrown at the green-haired desk jockey while Rikido began to speak more frankly. Don't you have friends outside of here? A girlfriend maybe? And quat. For some reason Izuku instantly felt a strange sense of embarrassment at that question, chuckling nervously as if he was being judged. Well, I have one friend. She's weird and a bit bossy, but nice to hang out with. And quat. Rikido pricked his lips up at that, his interest piqued in a high school kind of way. Oh, that's better than I thought. You have at least. This chick, what is she? Your fuck buddy or something? You don't exactly strike me as a guy to have kids, so also not your baby mama, right? And quat. Cherry red painted Izuku's face as he kept laughing to ease the anxiety mounting in his head, wishing he could keep a straight expression. No. She's just a person I hang out and train with every so often. We met one night while I was out on a walk. She helped me out of a mental funk I was in, and we've kinda just stuck around each other since nobody else seems to want us. In fact, she was the one who suggested I apply here. And quat. The muscled crime fighter raised an eyebrow at his comrade, interest and confusion showing in equal strides. What do you mean nobody else wants you? Are you trying to say nobody ever tried to get you in your whole life and it's the same for this broad? And quat. A hand rubbed the back of Izuku's neck self-consciously as old inadequacies started to seep in more and more. Well, not in a free-acting kind of way. See, my mom sets me up with these dates every so often with quirkless women. It's pretty much an attempt at an arranged marriage since being quirkless kinda sucks financially if you don't have a support system, so it's families trying to pair off the weakest link in the lineage. Unfortunately it hasn't worked since I'm not exactly comfortable in my own skin. And quat. Air was sucked in through his teeth as memories of his fading youth came back. And I have asked out a few women in my time, but nothing ever came of it. One time I even got humiliated in front of my entire class because I thought this one girl liked me, except it turned out it was to pull a prank. And quat. The hero shook his head in sympathy, tossing a bottle of water next to his sidekick. That's fucked all around, but what about this chick? What's her deal? Is she a mutant? And quat. Izuku opened his mouth to speak, but paused to consider for a moment. I don't know. Like she looks completely baseline save for cat-like eyes and long canines, but I don't know if you'd call that a mutation. As for her quirk, I gather it has to be emitter or transformation type since she's really guarded about it. Anyway, from what she's said, her life wasn't easy and that tends to push people away because nobody wants to deal with it. And quat. If it were possible for Rikido to raise his brow further, he would have done it. Hard how? Like she's bad to look at, her childhood trauma kind of bad? And quat. Izuku couldn't help but picture her face, noting every line and imperfection almost like a painting from when they met on that bridge. Oh no, she's beautiful, or rather she may have been beautiful once. It's just, she hasn't really explained it in depth, but you can tell she had a rough life. As to what that was, I don't think it's my place to say. And quat. He wanted to say more, but Izuku didn't fancy having it be common knowledge. A criminal, much less a former gang member, was the closest thing he had to a friend and who suggested he apply to his current position. Clearly Sato knew something was up, but malice was not in his eyes. Instead he allowed the topic to drift, perhaps out of respect for understanding the need to keep a secret for a friend. Alright, fair enough, but with that in mind, are you saying you never once got it with a chick? And quat. Izuku blushed again, feeling far more young than he should be. No, so far I haven't even kissed a girl. And quat. Nothing could ever make the look of pity on Rikido's face feel any less degrading to the less worldly man. That's pretty sad. A handsome fella like you still swimming around with some tail to grab. That's a damn shame. And quat. The expression remained for a few uncomfortable moments until he suddenly snapped his fingers and sat up in his seat. Hey, how about I set you up with one of my old classmates? She's been single since college and been looking for someone to pair up with. And quat. Izuku dug his back into the seat, wishing he could just disappear from the scene altogether. Why yeah, who is she? And quat. A sly glint overcame the sugar hero who cupped a hand over his chin. Mina Ashido, aka Acid Girl. She's the exact opposite of you in personality, so I think that might help make you relax a bit. That, and she's a B-ranked hero, who may be willing to teach you things and give you connections that could help out our little agency. And quat. Instantly all the flustered, inexperienced sensation faded as Izuku looked at his employer with a slanted, granite expression which sounded deadpan in every way. You're using this as another way to get a leg up, aren't you? And quat. Rikido spread his arms out wide in a sweeping motion to gesture to the room around them. Hey, you gotta be in this industry, besides it's just two birds with one stone. You get a relationship and I get more chances to go up, though I could probably hook you up with Tsuyu if that fails. She is a lot more grounded than Ashido and has a bit of a maternal aura, and I think she's as swamped with work as you are. And quat. A groan came from the couch when Izuku held his hands to his head. Slowly he stood up, feeling sharp pops of cartilage from his back that echoed from the walls. His eyes harbored an almost fleeting spark of defiance when he stared at the taller man. Anyway, romance aside, what the hell are we going to do for today? I can log back on the database to look, but frankly I think I'm done with that today unless you really need me to dot and quat. There was a curiosity nesting through the hero at the answer, one that retained the slyness of a man quick with his tongue and faster in wit. If I were to give you the day off, what would you do? And quat. Stay home or maybe go bug the crazy girl. Why? And quat. A smile set over Rikido, a mischievous, evil smile which Izuku hated the second it spawned. You spend a lot of time at her place, don't you? This girl has gotta be something special, right? Otherwise why do you keep going back? And quat. An eye roll was the response. Chill out, Captain Horndog. I keep going back because she puts up with me. Yeah, she's pretty, but there's a whole mountain of baggage under it. That, and I'm pretty sure she has a thing for seeing me in pain. And quat. Izuku felt his belly heave inward at the flashes of how Himiko reacted to each of his shouts and flares of anger and suffering. It wasn't quite fear. He kept visiting her after all. It was more uncertainty, as every one of their interactions was a mix of browbeating and reassurance. It hurt to spar with her and it pissed him off at times to argue. But in the 2 months they've known each other, Izuku found himself enjoying it. Sure, it sucked to feel his muscle bulge and bruise, even worse so when she insulted him, and yet he liked seeing that weirdly happy look on her face. All her attention was solely on him. Every act she did was in the name of helping him grow, and she glowed with a joy that made him feel good. At least with that he was doing something right, he hoped, and in a way he loved the attention. He was sure of it, and admittedly the way they cuddled afterwards was something he silently started to look forward to, if only because it was the only source of human contact he got, much less from a pretty woman, in his entire life. Inhaling as he realized the gaze his boss was giving upon hearing him stop midway after something so worrying, Izuku grabbed his things and turned to the door. If it's all the same to you, Chief, I'll call it a half day and go home. And quat. The concern lingered longer in the air than it should have, but it passed eventually. Sure, you've done more than enough today. We're meeting Ojiro and Shoji to discuss the case tomorrow at 11, so don't stay up too late, and Midoriya? And quat. He turned around. Yes? And quat. The world stood still for a heartbeat as Rikido stared him in the eye, showing nothing but brotherly concern. I'm here if you ever need to talk. And quat. Cheap craft beer, 6 plates of hot wings and a packed bar filled to the brim with off-duty heroes was not Izuku's idea for a meeting between those charged with the protection of society. Yet apparently he was alone in this thought, since Rikido, Ojiro and Shoji all conversed at the table they sat at last week like it was the most normal thing in the world. He hated the noise, and even though the tab was on the 3 of them, he stuck to water and listened like a third wheel while the pros talked about their current case, capture rates and other things. They had met at 11 in the morning like Sato said, yet it was nearing 8 in the afternoon with nothing really accomplished for the hours they traded. Sure, he had gotten to inform them of his notes, but he could barely explain Himiko's idea since they were busy with other things, leaving him to bottle up his professional frustrations. Turns out, Zaki managed to climb up the tree while the sitter was away. And quat. Shoji whistled in sympathetic pain for his tailed friend. 2 of his 6 hands transformed into mouths, with one for talking and another for eating. Damn, I bet Toru lost her mind at that. And quat. A hand was waved dismissively at the taller hero. Oh, you best believe it. She tore that lady a new one, but what can you do? Kids'll act like kids. And quat. The martial arts hero brought his eyes up to the only member of the party who had yet to say anything in the half hour they've been at the table. Softly his tail tapped against Izuku's leg, getting him to nearly jolt upright. So Mophead, what about you? Anything interesting going on in your life? And Apos. Izuku tugged at his collar, trying not to let his anxiety win over. And not really. Worked my day job, did some research for the case, that's about it. And quat. The room seemed to grow smaller under Ojiro's gaze. For most of his life, places like this were anathema to Izuku. It wasted money, time, and likely brought on unnecessary conflict if spirits started flowing enough. Being quirkless against someone who could perhaps set the air on fire or worse was never a winning equation, especially when he had no formal combat training. Yet here he was, in a situation he rarely had been in before, stuck right in the spotlight of 3 of the only people who might help him move up in the world. He wanted to be back at the office or his desk at the agency, somewhere he knew exactly how to act. An elbow lightly jabbed him in the ribs when Rikido stole the attention, perhaps to spare his sidekick the obvious discomfort he was having. Ah, don't worry about Broccoli Lad, he's just like Ida, all work and no fun. And quat. Both independent heroes gave a few seconds to study the neurotic newbie, taking in his face and eyes which had the quality of a panicked dog before answering back to the sugar hero. The focus faded away from Izuku within minutes as more reminiscing about things and times he had no clue about entered the conversation, just how he liked it. Let him be as wallpaper and simply vanish in all but body. At least nothing could go wrong that way, at least he couldn't be mocked or thought less of if he wasn't involved. Sighing silently in relief, Izuku leaned back with a sip of his water. This wasn't his life, not the sort he had adapted to live since turning 5 years old, and as such he didn't like it. Briefly he considered leaving and returning home, but technically this was a meeting to discuss the case, so that was out of the question. He had to endure it like every other shitty thing that came with a job. In his silence, Izuku found his mind wandering like it had for all his life, to things which might be better. He imagined himself as a different him, one who was strong, valiant and powerful with a quirk that demanded respect. Buildings raced below him as he leapt into the sky, and he found that he could shatter them with a single blow, just like All Might in his prime. People smiled, waved and shouted in gratitude for all he had done for them, praising him like a guardian. It was a finer life than the shit one he had been handed, one where he could be anything. But as was always the rule, Izuku eventually forced himself out of the fantasy, otherwise he wouldn't want to leave, not that he did in the first place. It was beyond horrible to retreat back to old habits when trying to move forward, yet as he slumped in his seat with another half-hour passed of pointless conversation from the pros, he noticed something move out of the corner of his eye that caught his attention in the crowd. Sitting at the counter in the densely packed space was a brunette girl with a roundish face dotted by 2 pink circles where dimples may have been staring at him critically. She had a half glass in her hand which was barely touched while she kept a pinky raised off it, revealing a sort of padding at the end of the digit. Her hazel eyes didn't look away when he noticed, and the two had a sort of stare down, except it was more akin to curiosity rather than hostilities. Her attire consisted of an ugly brown overcoat and jeans which looked cheap even to him, and the liquor in her cup looked close to rot gut judging by the color. It took him a minute to recognize who he was looking at, and nearly had a heart attack when he understood that Aravati herself was looking his way. That girl was a legend in her own right at the age of 24 already, from having the second highest number of rescues on record that barely lingered below All Might's. He soon berated himself mentally for entering his geeky fanboy mindset. She was just a woman looking to relax for the night after some hard work, nothing more. Yet he had to shift in his seat when she got off her stool and began to approach the table. The others turned their heads in her directions, and a sudden apprehension filled the air. Out of the 3 of them, Shoji was the only one able to start a conversation with the girl, while his friends kept the uncomfortable rigidity of themselves, making sure to avoid direct eye contact with the brunette. "Hey, Uraka, have you been ? Inquat. The anti-gravity heroine smiled warmly at her former classmates, standing by the edge of the table with a waft of lilac perfume coming over the air. "Oh, you know, same old, same old. Hey, not to be rude, but do you mind if I borrow your friend here for a minute ? Inquat. The trio collectively raised an eyebrow at the heroine, yet Izuku found himself seeing a way out from the situation and took it. He stood up from his seat a hair too fast for his liking and felt the same flustered exasperation that came from somewhere deep in his neurotic self. Sure. Inquat. Uraka pursed her lips into a mask-like smile and began to lead towards the door. Izuku followed soon after, while those at his table gave a look of pity as he exited the bar to the cold night outside. The moon was full and shining, granting a heavy illumination to the streets that Izuku was infinitely grateful for when he finally was away from the crowd. The anti-gravity heroine continued to walk off to the east until she was at the side of an adjacent building, far enough away from the windows of the pub so that no one from inside could see them, while Izuku made to copy her, glad to simply have some breathing room for a while. The mood Uraka exuded changed somewhat to a far more critical one that melted away her smile into a neutral line. Casually she reached into a pocket on her coat and withdrew a pack of menthol cigarettes. Opening the pack and popping one in her mouth as a lighter was taken from her other coat pocket, she regarded him. "Sorry about pulling you from your pals like that. Inquat." Izuku placed 2 hands up in the air, feeling for all the world like he just stepped out of a fire. "And no, it's fine. I don't do well in crowds anyway. Inquat." A flame came from the lighter, igniting the tobacco with a silent huff when the brunette took a hit which caused Izuku to wrinkle his nose. "Nice to know I'm not intruding then. Anyway, I felt the need to introduce myself since you look like the new guy to our little family. Ricky always handled things alone, and news traveled fast enough that I caught word of it when he hired a sidekick for the first time. I hope he's treating you well enough. Inquat." The greenete shrugged nervously with his view to the side. The girl had an air of being both welcoming and otherwise that made him unsure of what to expect, yet he still felt the need to speak. Sato's a good boss for what he is, though I've only worked a couple weeks for him. As for introductions, I don't think you really need to. You're the anti-gravity hero Aravati. Everybody with a pulse knows who you are. Inquat. Sighing at his own uppityness, Izuku leaned back against the wall and looked up at the moon, suddenly relieved of his flusteredness by old emotion stirring up. "Shit, I apologize about that. I get that everybody hears off-duty and code names are dirty words when you're off the clock, but I think I need to say this offhand. What you did for people during and after the war stopped a lot of suffering, including what your family's company did in the reconstruction effort. My mom's apartment got demolished by that giant, and it was thanks to you and yours we didn't go homeless for long. So, thanks. Inquat. Kicking the dirt, he extended a hand to the pro, hoping he wasn't stuck looking like a Deku. "Anyway, My name's Izuku Midoriya, or the Limit Breaker if you catch me on duty. Inquat. A padded hand grasped him while a pinky was kept away. Uraka Ochako, and I appreciate it. People write to me every so often about that, but I never get to really see it. Inquat. She studied him once more, withdrawing her hand and pulling out a second cigarette to offer, which was declined. Anyway, I wanted to scope you out a bit. You never really see quirkless folk in this profession, and I wanted to know what brings you in? Being the curiosity that you are and all. Inquat. A glare was sent her way by the green-eyed man before that vanished. He had to deal with that discrimination all his life, and despite it being more akin to pity than scorn in most cases, it still pissed him off. Regardless, he supposed it didn't matter right now. It's an old childhood dream of mine. I always wanted to be like All Might, but I never really applied myself to anything until now. Truth be told, it's more of a hobby since I have a normal day job. Inquat. She nodded with the stick in her hands as white smoke went up from the burning end. I see. Mind me asking what changed from before now? Inquat. Izuku clicked his tongue at the question. He certainly felt easier than he first did, but explaining that was difficult and how to properly step around the reason he was motivated in the first place. I met someone who convinced me to go for it since I'll be dead one day anyway. Though in all honesty, I kinda did it to prove them wrong about me. Inquat. Uraka's body language shifted at that, becoming more standoffish and somewhat confrontational. This person, are they someone special to you? Inquat. A raised eyebrow answered back at her when Izuku began to get uncomfortable from her tone. Excuse me? Inquat. She shrugged as if suddenly realizing how that sounded. I'm just saying that since this one person gave you a reason to change your life around, then they have to mean something to you, right? Inquat. Izuku found himself biting his lips habitually like he did in high school. What was Himiko to him? He wasn't anything much to her in all likelihood, and she wasn't his ideal vision of a woman, but she did put up with a Deku like him. Meaning there had to be something worth remembering in there. Though that might be more from her being even lower on the social totem pole than him, combined with an admittedly off-putting quirk that probably scared everyone else away. She was pretty, and if he was a less virtuous man, then perhaps he'd try to get somewhere physically with her, or maybe not, considering the frightening lengths she's gone to deter such things. His weeks weren't as boring, thanks to her, and he knew for a fact he owed her for giving the push he needed. So she did mean something to him, just not exactly something he understood. She's a good friend who helped in a rough situation. I was going through some stuff mentally, and she, for lack of a better word, browbeat me into getting better. Inquat. The heroine continued to gauge him with an obvious critical eye, and he nearly flinched from the barb hidden in her tone. What did she say exactly? It had to be something remarkable to motivate you that much from just a conversation. Inquat. Izuku thrust his line of sight to the side once more, intent on not acquiring the woman's wrath from some unknown slight. That I'd be dead one day, so I need to at least try. She pretty much pissed me off enough that I wanted to spite her assumption about me, which is why I'm here today. That girl kinda gives me a reason not to give up, because if I do, then she'll be right about me being a coward. Inquat. The words tumbled out from his subconscious as he spoke, and rather than being embarrassed about the overly attached wording, Izuku merely shrugged at it. She was the closest thing he had to a friend now, and by extension was a reason to keep going, because it was a contest between them. If he gave up, then she'd win. If he kept moving forward, then he'd win. Uraka had a small smile about her when her vice was finished. That's actually pretty sweet. So is she your steady? Because you seem to value her opinion quite a bit. Inquat. A blush overcame Izuku's freckled cheeks that hit him like a bucket of ice water, shocking his nerves and making him flinch. What? Oh, no, she's just a friend. That's all. Inquat. Uraka flicked the flame on her lighter once more to illuminate the space around her out of habit, extinguishing it again and again to keep her hands busy. Her expression was utterly unreadable, with a small grin that would have fitted better on a porcine doll. Have you ever been in a romantic relationship before? Midoriya? Inquat. Anger flooded his veins instantly, banishing the emotions as he was suddenly reliving every humiliating time something like this happened. Was it really that obvious? That's my own business. Why do you want to know? Inquat. She shrugged while continuing to flick the flint of the plastic lighter. The heroine regarded him with that same doll-like sorta smile that made her hard to gauge. You're new to the game, so I want to get to know you better, and one of the best ways to figure someone out is through their love history. Which begs the question, what exactly do you like in a woman? Inquat. She twirled a finger in the air in a circular motion as if to get her mind working. Do you like strong, violent women? Weak, submissive women? Because you kinda strike me as a sub, if I'm being honest. Inquat. She squinted at him, taking note of his face in the moonlight. That and maybe a thing for bondage, if I'm not mistaken. Inquat. Thousands of words, millions of reactions, trillions of thoughts Izuku could have used in this situation, regardless of how weird it was. Yet he froze. He froze like a deer in the headlights, because he was sure that the number 6 hero was hitting on him and trying to proposition him for some weird BDSM session. What should he do? He'd never been in a scene like this before, much less when his dream could be affected. Sure, he was flattered, but was this something she did with every newcomer? He had read rumors online about midnight back before the war that summed up a thing like this. Granted, most of the alleged posters said they regretted it later. Yet, this could lead to increased mobility for him and Sato, couldn't it? Staring at her expectant expression, he pursed his lips. Well, she was beautiful in the least, and there were worse ways to move up. Besides, he owed Sato for giving him the chance to become a member of the hero industry. With a flush of blood rushing to his face, Izuku swallowed the little shard of pride he had left. So what if I am ? She inhaled at his response in shallow disappointment, shaking her head and placing a hand on his shoulder. The hazel of her eyes shone with a quiet sadness. Then that's what it is. You seem like a swell enough guy. For now, just promise me you'll take care of this friend of yours, okay? You've been a treat to talk to, and I'll be sure to hit you up later, but I'm going home. Then without another word, the brunette turned around out of the alley between the two buildings and walked deeper in the night, heading west, leaving Izuku to wonder exactly what happened and what he may have done wrong. Heading back into the pub, Izuku found his table and took his seat next to Rikido, who along with the other two looked at him questioningly. Ojiro grinned mischievously at his flustered face, likely noting the red tips of his ear as Izuku silently sat down. So what did the Dragon Queen want from you? I hope for your sake she didn't ask for a favor, since Explosion Boy will probably blow a gasket. That's not a position anybody wants to find themselves in, let me tell you. Hell, all of us have the burn scars to prove it. Shoji flicked the martial arts hero on the side of the head, causing him to grunt in pain as the mutant consoled the least experienced member of their group. Don't mind him, Midoriya. He's just pissed because Bakugo always kicked his ass. There wasn't any need for an explanation, even if he had no clue who the bastard was. Katsuki Bakugo always broadcasted his government name to the world once he hit it big. His real name was just as highly held up in modern society as his code name, though there were never any articles hinting at him and Aravity being a thing. Izuku didn't get a chance to speak since Ojiro glared at the multi-arm hero like he just threw somebody off a cliff. Don't feed him that shit, Squid Boy. You know as well as any of us how that asshole gets when it comes to her. He practically beat Kaminari into a coma in our third year when he tried to ask her out, and he's only gotten more nuts since graduating. Rikido rubbed his temples at the argument between his friends and cut it at last when he couldn't take it anymore. Give the man a chance to speak, damn it. Uraka has always been the welcoming type, so it's likely they just exchanged professional courtesies. Right bro? Izuku slumped back in his seat as more strawberry red colored his skin. Then after seeing the quizzical reactions of his peers be soon followed by a show of shock, he stood up and walked towards the exit. I'm going home. So he can't bend like ? Izuku held in a sigh when he saw Himiko lean in by his shoulder with a pixie stick in her mouth to get a better look at his screen. No, because if he could then he wouldn't show up at all, and he doesn't leave any footprints directed out of the stores. Ergo, he is either becoming light or being absorbed in a flash. Maybe. Peeling away from the computer, he rubbed his eyes. The sheer amount of quirks on this thing is insane, and I've even narrowed it down to only emitter type since that's the only reason I can go with. It had been hours since he started to work on this case again, seeing as his company gave him the day off due to working too much overtime, which left him with nothing to do. Lately it felt like he was running himself into the ground with both his obligations, but he couldn't slow down or nothing would get done. Granted, he had grown bored of the quiet of his apartment and made the choice to spend the time at Himiko's if only for the company. She was glad for the visit even if they weren't training, that he was sure of. Though as she sat next to him on the sofa, the weight of weeks came down and he needed to close the computer. Purple bags had gathered under his eyes and he looked haggard with the green 5 o'clock shadow nesting around his chin. It needed to get done because he was the only one working on it, but he was just too burned out to continue the way he had. Turning his head to the blonde who stared back quizzically, Izuku got up with a sigh at his own weakness and grabbed a blanket off the love seat before squeezing himself into the larger couch. His legs bumped against her back and Himiko kept feigning confusion until he motioned in an almost grabbing, clutching motion with his hands while the blanket rested over an arm extended above the floor. She was dressed in black sweatpants and an oversized fuzzy, yellow sweater with her long hair completely down as she grinned slyly at him. Well, aren't you being needy today? He glared at her and had half a mind to just grab her until she stopped squirming in that taunting, playful way she did like when they trained. Oh, shut up, I need to relax and this helps you too, don't deny it. Now shut up and lay down. A finger flicked him in the nose as a cruel smile formed at the resistance within him. Perhaps I can show you what happens to disrespectful little brats. Usually he would have fired back a bit, maybe with a taunt of his own to simply liven up the cold air in the apartment, but he wasn't in the mood for that. Instead he sat up and gently placed a hand on her arm, knowing for a fact he looked like a mix between a sad puppy and a homeless man. Saying it hurt his pride a little. He knew a man was supposed to take or earn what he gets, yet he couldn't really bargain right now and he wasn't about to make more demands over something so pointless. Himiko, can you please just lay down? The blonde girl blinked at that, her smile fading away in confusion before returning with a vengeance when she scanned the body language he had. Her teeth were exposed to the air, making the 5'2" woman look far more threatening as she got on all four. Slowly she crawled over to him, smelling the building apprehension hiding in his skin until she was on top of him. Those green eyes regarded her in a blend of mild fear and hope. It was so adorable. A hand caressed his cheek paisley, gathering every bit of touch, and allowed him to get used to it as she patted him like a loyal pet. He stared at her, confused, frightened and needing, as those yellow eyes stared right back with all the mirth of a cat playing with a toy. A thumb touched the crook of his nose when she stroked to the top of his cheek, tapping it softly. "Well, since you're begging, I guess I have too." However, in Quat, the hand which had been rubbing his cheek raised up with an open palm, hovering midway in the air. "You need to learn not to talk to me like that." In Quat, like a cobra, it came down and smacked him across the cheek with a crack like that of a pistol shot in the silence of the room. Izuku's head snapped to the side, clenching every muscle when he saw what was coming. His face stung, and it showed with how he cringed at the rhythmic pain, yet the chance to recover never came, since she clasped the sides of his head with both hands, sinking her body directly on top of his with all her weight as she made him look her in the eye. "If you want something, you ask. You don't give orders to me. I can push because I teach you how to fight, so that's fair trade. You have to ask me nicely and I might do it. That way things stay pleasant with neither of us screaming at each other. Okay?" And Quat. Despite himself, Izuku slowly grinned at the blonde with a light of defiance in his soul. Quickly he brought the blanket down over them both and wrapped both arms around her, instantly banishing the cold. "Alright, but I think I'll be making a few demands anyway." And Quat. He tightened down his hold across her back and moved them both to the side, pushing him to the back of the sofa while she took the edge. Himiko rolled her eyes at him, but dug into the hold as the chill left. They grasped each other without a word, falling to the comfort of rubbing the other's back. Already Izuku found himself able to breathe a little easier. So much had been put on his plate recently that he didn't have time to just relax. First, his job had been mounting twice as much work on everybody since it was nearing the fiscal year of the company. Then he needed to solve this stupid case that nobody else seemed to care about, and he still needed to train on top of it all. Not to mention having to listen to his mother every other week start going on and on about stupid shit like him getting married or buying a house. Briefly he shifted around in the sheet and pulled Himiko closer, placing his chin on top of her shoulder as her heartbeat echoed in his ears. He felt her legs tangle around his lower body and wrap close when she did the same. His eyes shut in an attempt to drown out the world, to just focus on the moment with this lonely girl who likely had no one else either. Her breathing complemented the air, and for a moment, a solid moment, he wished it could stay like that, where nothing was going to hurt him, where he was safe, not alone and held. He didn't want to let go. He wanted to stay under this blanket with this girl forever, because the world outside was cold, unkind and ugly. She was safe here with him. She wasn't alone here. More, he squeezed on her back as if he was afraid someone would take the warmth she brought. Izuku didn't know what the hell he was doing, at all. His life was a sad, pathetic mess that only got better by a hair. He worked the same shit job for years, had no real friends, and his mother was getting older with each passing day. He was going to be alone in the big scary world with nobody to help. His life was that of a weakling, where he was scared of every little thing, where he was horrified of crossing the wrong person because they might have a power that could reduce him to atoms. Nothing made sense anymore, not since that white-haired monster attacked everything. There were so many criminals and monsters roaming the streets. Nobody had enough to eat. Nobody could figure out how or why this was happening. It was just a chaotic hell on earth for people clutching at their teeth that were too weak to survive, like him. All might was gone. He couldn't save the day anymore, and the only people left who could were like Kachan. The world would eat him one day, and perhaps another insane criminal king would try to recreate the attempt of the second, taking away everything Izuku cherished. The only thing he had left was his dying dream, a soulless job and this lost girl. So why wouldn't he just want to stay on this sofa with her until the end of everything, when those things were waiting? At least she kinda valued him. Well, he couldn't, could he? They'd both cramp eventually anyway. Opening his eyes, Izuku flipped onto his back and ran his fingers through the golden locks. Himiko raised her head up and hummed in annoyance from having to move her limbs, watching the man she saved play with her hair. They said nothing for a while, the two content to simply be, until Izuku spoke up. "So, I think gravity hit on me yesterday." And Quat. Himiko paused completely, looking at him like he suddenly spoke French. "Say what?" And Quat. He shrugged, carefully running a hand down the back of her head. "I was at a bar with Sugarman and a few other pros to discuss the jewel thief case, which went nowhere by the way, and she happened to be at the counter. Well, long story short, she invited me outside and started asking me these weird-ass questions." And Quat. The blonde blinked in an attempt to process what was said. Like ? And Quat. Izuku pursed his lips in embarrassment, a red hue coming over his cheeks. "Like if I've ever been in a relationship before, what type of girls I like, if I'm a dom or sub." And Quat. He looked Himiko straight in the eye, hoping she'd at least agree it was strange. The woman asked if I liked bondage or not. And quat. Gears turned quickly in the slasher's head when she started to make a picture of how, why and where. Then it hit her. Smiling something not worth half of what she was actually feeling, she decided to keep pressing. So what did you say? And quat. Izuku paused at her expression, feeling more shame mounted on top of him. I said yes because I figured that maybe I could use the connection to get better cases for Sato's agency. She seemed to not really like that answer because she just wished me a good night and left. And quat. Laughter instantly filled the room as Himiko collapsed onto him, her belly heaving from how hard she was laughing. It was a high-pitched giggle that continued on and on until she was red in the face. Eventually she found her breath and poked him on the nose. Holy shit, you were ready to whore yourself out like some gigolo just to get your boss some better work? That's sad. And quat. He bit the bottom of his lip at her teasing, no longer able to quite look her in the eye. Well, yes, but she was also very pretty. And quat. Himiko flicked him in the nose once more with a smirk. And I'm not? And quat. Izuku's eyes grew wide at the question. How and why did he have to respond to that when she was so close? Not to mention that this might lead to a knife getting pulled on him. And no, you are, it's just in quat. Just that she might be able to let you live out that nasty fantasy you have of being tied up and fucked? And quat. He sat up, practically pushing the girl off him as indignation colored him. I'm not into bondage. I just said it because I thought that's what she wanted to hear! And quat. An arm reached from under the blanket he still had on his shoulders and coiled around him like a snake as Himiko regained the distance, opening the blanket and squishing him to the armrest of the sofa while she giggled at his expense. Hey, no same in having a kink, Greenie. But let me warn you, Floaty isn't as free as she'd like to believe. She had a fling with Dynamite back when they were teens that lasted half a decade. Long story short, he's still nuts about her and not in a good way. Hell, some guys that have tried to court her ended up either moving out of the country or in the hospital with broken legs from unknown assailants, as the media would put it. And quat. A glare entered Izuku's eyes, one possessed of anger and old pain as his hands clenched and popped. He said nothing, did nothing as he suddenly went rigid, only gazing ahead in a silent fury. So that fucker could get away with that much? Kachan got to do anything he wanted because. He inhaled and buried the anger. This wasn't the time nor place for that. When he was alone and not in arm's reach of anyone he'd vent. Right now he was with a friend in his happy place, so his bullshit could wait. Could we talk about something else, please? And quat. Himiko narrowed her eyes towards his face. She saw every one of those emotions flash through his skin and each was more interesting than the last. There was a story here and it brought a journalistic tingle to her spine. First though, was to eliminate the probable causes until only one left. Pulling herself closer to him and running a hand through his hair, she put her chin on his shoulder. I take it you're not a fan of Katsuki Bakugo, are you? And quat. At once his body clenched like one massive muscle at the name. He inhaled again, standing up with flexing hands that continually shaped into fists while his shoulders rolled. He moved about the room in some vain attempt to ease the pent-up anger which barely worked. No, and I'd rather speak about anything else if you don't mind. And quat. She raised an eyebrow, feeling the familiar hook get drawn in her brain whenever something interesting was happening. Why? Ain't like we have much else to do. And quat. He snapped forward with his teeth bared in a snarl, causing the girl to not move in the slightest. How about you start talking about your quirk then, since you want to share private shit so much? And quat. The words passed his lips in a rage-fueled haze, and the instant they left, Izuku recoiled at his own actions. Guilt weighed heavily on him when he realized he had broken his number one rule of never lashing out at another because of his past. Himiko, however, continued to stare at him with a distant attention, as if she could slice away the blockage around the answer. He lowered his head like a dog who pissed on the rug, the same way he did with his teachers, his employers, his mother. Auntie Mitsuki and Kachan saw him fuck up somehow and he'd get chewed out for it. Except he honestly expected something violent given how she acted around him, and he knew he was totally in the wrong this time, so he deserved it. Sorry. And quat. There came a touch on his cheek, a gentle one that brought his eyes upward to see Himiko shaking her head with not an ounce of malice in her cat-like eyes. Understanding shone through them, with her guiding him back to the sofa. No, it isn't your fault, Izuku. I should have stopped when you asked. Believe me, if anybody knows what it's like to have skeletons in your closet, it's me. Now, how about we get back to fixing that case? And quat. He stared at her in wonder for what felt like forever. She hadn't hit him, or cursed him out, or cried, or threatened to kick him out? Izuku smiled warmly at the blonde, wrapping the blanket around the both of them and opening his laptop, sure that they would figure it out. He was happy to keep going, to strive in order to go somewhere, and this was only the first out of many, because so long as he wasn't alone he knew he would succeed. Izuku had no hatred of security guards. He didn't loathe them or their profession. They did honest hard work like everyone else and provided a needed service for the world. Yet as he sat at his desk in the office of his day job, Izuku was doing everything in his power not to lose his composure like he had for the past 3 hours. A goddamn knuckle-dragging idiot who didn't even have a college diploma managed to find the fucker he had spent weeks trying to figure out his identity. What was worse was that this bastard actually managed to catch the sob by tackling him when he had to come back inside for his ID badge. Yet nobody praised it massively. There wasn't a segment in the news or even a hint online. It came and went without anyone caring. The only reason he knew was because Rikido called him late last night to let him know the case was closed and they were free to move on to other stuff. He wasted so much time, lost so much sleep and nearly pulled his hair out trying to help fix this ridiculous issue that had been placed upon him, only for it to mean absolutely nothing. He wanted to scream, to bash his head against a wall, but he couldn't. He was at his job which allowed him to stay in his apartment and fed. So he bottled it up like he was taught through years of pressure and put on a mask of professionalism, typing away at his keyboard despite the demon screaming in his brain. Izuku was not an angry man usually since his anger was mocked at best and ridiculed at worst. He never could shout and scream and have things go his way like that asshole did. He was just a basic, simple man and that was it. Thus he had to follow the rules because he wasn't special like the great Katsuki Bakugo. Sighing in his quiet torment he lowered himself closer to the screen, dumping his emotions and part of his personality to nowhere as he continued to input data and fill out forms. 5 more hours to go, then I can scream ... and quad. He thought to himself as the clock ticked away. It was his lot in life for this to happen now that he thought about it. He was Deku, people always called him that, deemed him worthless even if he was trying his damnedest to renew his lease on life. The universe or rather fate decided to have the coin land tails instead of heads. 2 steps forward 1 step back. Still he found himself wanting something. He wasn't sure what it was exactly, but as he held in the emotions there was a desire to distract, to escape the bad luck that plagued this current attempt. The scene changed in his head to Himiko's apartment where he could train and laugh and relax instead of this quiet hell. In a strange way he found himself missing the woman's presence since he was allowed to be angry and honest around her. Lately Izuku had not wished to return to his own apartment like he used to. There were so many things to do and get done that it was a moot point when he had a far busier life now. Heck, maybe he could show up to the agency and throw a couple rounds with Sato in the ring. Sure, he may lose, but it would make him feel better. What did it matter? Sure, his life was certainly better than before, but only in that he had more things to occupy his time. Everything else was the same. He was the same person in body, in soul and in mind. Granted, he no longer wanted to throw himself off a bridge anymore, but that wasn't something grand and massive. It was him getting better. Part of him wanted to be someone else, to be a person like he fantasized about being. Maybe if he had been born with that explosion quirk instead of Kachan, he'd be the one in the history books and that Sham would be in this chair writing away numbers. He was the limit breaker, but without any real attempts of pushing past barriers or proof of it having weight behind it. It was nothing more than a meaningless title made and given to a weakling. Yet with that in mind, how could he make that mean anything? The only thing people valued in this world, or rather the hero world, was results produced by violence. If he was 10th Dan in judo or a master of boxing or any other fighting art, he'd still be less in sheer destructive potential than someone like Elemental or Kachan by the simple fact of their quirks. They were literal gods on the urban battlefield and at the very least could single-handedly take on the entire police division and likely win. And he knew he was far from ready to actually take on a villain. As he continued to tap away on the keyboard, the quirkless office worker found his mind drifting to an old, seemingly irrelevant piece of info he saw years ago before the war. He was 16 when he first heard of Stain and, like most people without a massive chip on their shoulders, considered the Slayer to be little more than a psychopathic murderer with a flair for twisting words to justify what he did. However, looking back, Izuku remembered reading about how the man took down over 40 pro heroes with nothing more than a sword and a few pocket knives. That was impressive no matter how it was looked at, and the man only had a quirk that brought a minor edge to combat. The rest was him being willing to put his life on the line for his insane philosophy. Perhaps he could be that good. His goal wasn't murder, of course, but he wanted to be a physical threat in a fight instead of a dead weight or a victim. He was quirkless after all, so naturally he would be given more leniency in the possession of a weapon, especially if it was registered as a tool for hero use by the Sugarman Agency. Izuku pictured himself with a sword and shrugged. If it helped, so be it. He still had to train physically to really get anywhere like he wanted. When lunchtime rolled around, he sat alone like he had for the past 15 months, content to consume his shitty cup ramen before returning to work. Yet this normal state of affairs would not be when one of his co-workers approached his table. A tall man of lanky build with dyed red hair which matched his lava-colored eyes came forward. Dressed in the required gray suit of the company was Mushi Tensen, a fellow drone who had less seniority than Izuku by only 2 years. In his hand was a pre-made bento that one could purchase from any convenience store in the nation and a smile on his face. "Hey Midoriya, mind if I take a seat?" ? And quad. The two of them were not close. Izuku had no great dislike of the man, nor did he think Tensen had any reason to be against him. They were simple work colleagues who shared a word every so often about meaningless things. Putting his chopsticks to the side, Izuku gestured to the empty seats around him. Help yourself. Tenzin took the chair and began to lay out his meal while his face was unusually cheerful. Sweet, I just thought to give you some time since you've been eating by yourself for the past couple of months. So what's new with you? Nobody really knows what you're up to since you barely talk most days. The green-haired man shrugged, not displeased by the turn of events nor glad for them. He took a bite from the ramen cup and figured out the most natural way of speaking. Nothing much, been working out a little more. Again the redhead laughed as he pointed a finger at his senior's arms. That's obvious, you look like a bodyguard under that suit. So I gotta ask dude, what's your deal? You've been here for over 2 years but there's nothing big about you. He extended a fisted hand and slowly began to count off the fingers. You never say more than 10 words to anybody in a day. You never talk about anything going on in your life with anybody here. Not once have you gone out drinking with us. You eat the exact same thing every day and nobody knows a damn thing about you. The younger man leaned forward in a conspicuous manner, looking around like he was about to share a deep secret. Honestly, people around here are starting to think you're a serial killer with how withdrawn you are, and frankly I'm getting concerned with how often you seem to get angry. Like you don't outwardly show it, but I see how your face gets red every so often when you think nobody is looking. Izuku stared at the man, not sure on how to take this information. He had been accused of being many things, but a killer was not one of them, even as a joke. Surely it was a hyperbole, yet he could understand where his coworker was coming from. Setting his meal aside, he leaned back in his chair and felt the air rush out of his spirit. Truth be told Tenzin, I just try to get by one day at a time. I keep to myself because it's the best thing to do. It keeps away unneeded drama and lets me live an easier life. I have a few things going on in my life, but the reality is that I'm just a very boring person. I work 8 hours a day, then I go to a gym or I spend some time at a friend's place until I have to sleep and do it over again. That's my life in a nutshell. The concern remained on the younger man's face as he also leaned back in his seat. So why do you get so angry? I've seen your face go cherry red before and you just hold that in. You have to be hurting quite a bit to that point. Izuku pursed his lips and shrugged once again. Well, I can tell you neither I or anybody else I know are or were serial killers. I just got a lot of stuff from my past weighing on me at times. Those red eyes suddenly blazed with a deep sympathy, the causal tone of his voice shifting to one more swelling with a shared emotion. Have you thought of going to therapy? Izuku waved a hand at him, finding the statement utterly ridiculous for what it was. It's not that bad, I wasn't abused by my parents or anything massive, I just got bullied a lot in school. I should have gotten over it already, really. A hand was placed on his shoulder right as the bell sounded for them to return to work. That stuff can still leave a scar. Izuku rolled his eyes at the man and left for his desk. Later on a torn sofa in a place reeking of copper and cigarette smoke, he kept his gaze even as a sweaty arm wrapped around his neck. There was no fighting to be had, not after a 2-hour sparring session which drained most of the fury from his body. She had won by 8-2 in their stick matches and, as was her right by victory, taunted him endlessly. Yet now Izuku simply brought her closer, almost wishing he could reach a hand around her belt line or inside her shirt for no other reason than he wanted to. Himiko was a beautiful woman in her own right, and the proximity they shared almost daily made him notice the more feminine aspects of her. And if he believed that she would have tolerated such risque behavior from him, he would. After all, the woman teased him with offers like that often. Perhaps he should take her up on one of those just to see the look on her face. But he didn't want to press the blonde into disliking him, given her active dismissal and outright hostility to the concept of anything semi-sexual in nature happening in reality. He was happy here, best not to ruin it. So Izuku ran a hand down her long hair and enjoyed her closeness. Cat-like eyes stared up at him curiously, yet Himiko wasn't the first to break the silence as she planned. Instead, Izuku caressed her bare arm in an almost possessive manner and asked without hesitation. So, do you know where I could buy a katana? She continued to stare at him wordlessly with the expression of one confused. Izuku clenched his teeth at her expression, hoping he hadn't crossed an unknown line. Legally, of course. The blonde reclined into the couch cushions and brought him tumbling down on top of her with a yank to the neck. Of all the things to ask me, why that? You want to go cosplay as a ninja or something? His head rested in a cradle just below her chest, the tight-fitting exercise wear doing nothing to conceal the pleasing bends in her figure as he climbed up to her side, putting an arm around her belly to enjoy the sensation of holding someone while his back was to the rest of the sofa. No, this is gonna sound weird and I swear I'm not going to start slashing people, but you remember Stain, right? That first hero killer from back when we were kids? She turned her head to him with a raised eyebrow and a well-concealed hint of guilt in her voice. Yes? Izuku brought a hand down the side of her cheek, much like she had done for him the previous night. Well, He managed to take down almost 50 heroes with one of those swords despite having no physically enhancing or offensive quirk. It was all IMSO and quad. She cut in, almost shell-shocked with the words she put in his mouth. So you want to get one to pay homage to him while you're doing hero work and quad. He scowled at the assumption with a visible look of disgust on his face. Still he rubbed her back, feeling every twitch and dive made with each breath she took. No, it's that he was practically quirkless and he still was a massive threat in a fight. He nearly took down 8 heroes at once and would have won if Lemillion hadn't been there to stop him. So maybe I can be that dangerous in a fight if I had one and quad. Himiko smiled at the statement, her eyes looking far away at something Izuku couldn't start to guess at. If one of my old buddies was still around he'd probably start preaching for fucking hours about that. Stain was a big inspiration to him and he practically worshipped the dude. I remember one time our boss said something crass about swords and, by God did Lizard Boy go off on him and quad. Her arms closed tighter around Izuku, uncomfortably tight like he was about to vanish. His ribs ached as a glassy quality overcame her yellow eyes. There was a quiver to her voice that sounded close to breaking. I miss them and quad. She said not to Izuku or anyone else, but rather the universe itself or perhaps the spirits of the long dead to let them know they weren't forgotten. This state lasted for 5 good minutes until Himiko all but buried herself in his chest, her nails digging painfully into the skin of his arms and drawing thin, fine lines of crimson. Izuku said nothing and let her be, only caressing her back in an attempt of providing comfort to one who had done such for him. Eventually she did come back up with a slight wetness on her face that was quickly wiped away. I know where you could get a couple swords for free. My buddy kept caches all over before he passed on and they weren't used for anything. So you could register them as support items. Knowing him he'd probably be thrilled to have somebody using his gear for heroic purposes as he put it and quad. She squinted at him for a moment, checking his arms and feeling the quality of his chest muscles with a hand before getting up from the cuddle. Without a word Himiko retreated to her room and returned with a long, slender piece of wood carved in the shape of a sword. Izuku recognized it as a bokken and he mentally frowned at the serious look she was giving him. Though I also know that he'd haunt me to the grave if somebody without proper dedication took up his tools. Have you ever handled a sword before and quad? Himiko scoffed at her own question and took up a stance with both hands on the stick. Oh, who the fuck am I kidding? Of course you haven't. That would be actually useful for a hero to know and quad. He rolled his eyes at the insult and remained where he was, imbibing the feel of a lazy person to a T. A quality entered his eyes, a coy, playful one that made him smirk as he felt his hands flex. What exactly would I need to say to get you to lay back down and quad? She scowled at him, pointing the fake sword meaningfully in his direction. Nothing, because I owe it to my friend to make you worthy enough to hold what he held. Besides, I thought you wanted to be a hero. Heroes don't slack off and quad. He grinned at that. First off, yes they do. Secondly, I do want to be a hero, but I already did my rounds today and I can't risk having an injury from overdoing it. So what I want now is to lay down with you while my body recovers. Is that so wrong and quad? A soft whack came from the weapon hitting him in the side as she continued to bubble in anger at his words. You're being a lazy piece of shit right now. You have to keep pushing if you want results. My friend trained day and night for years to be good enough to fight and you aren't willing to do the same? How can you call yourself a man if you aren't willing to chase after what you want and quad? Izuku shook his head joyfully as he sat up with a light bruise developing on his torso. What I want, darling, is to relax. To be more honest, what I really want is to run my hands up and down you again. But since we've come to an impasse, how about a wager and quad? The bokken lowered in her hands at the proposition. Her usual violent reaction to such a statement was subdued, if only because they'd known each other long enough to know Izuku wasn't the sort to be forceful with such wants. I'm listening and quad. He stood up from the sofa, stretching as he watched her stare with that feral indignation. This is the game. You try to stop me from pulling you back to the couch, and if you do, then I'll train with you right here, right now. If I manage to get you back to the sofa, you gotta put it up for the night and we sleep together like usual. You can use anything at your disposal except blades and you can hit anywhere except my balls, neck or face while I can only use my hands. Deal and quad. The woman studied him for a minute, studying his expression before firing off another question. You want something else, don't you and quad? Izuku flinched at how she seemed to penetrate his thoughts. A heavy blush filled his face as he looked away in shame. Why yeah, but that's not at the top of my priorities. It's just and quad. He rubbed an arm in embarrassment, wishing he could wave it away like any other uncomfortable conversation through white lies or diversion. But he knew Himiko wasn't the sort to not notice such misdirection. Part of him thought to actually leave, so ashamed he was of the thoughts and how it could ruin their relationship, but another, more desperate part almost screamed for him to say it. Rejection be damned. Slowly they made eye contact once more since he was fearful of her lunging with that practice blade. Pursing his lips he decided to be a man and say what was on his mind. When we hold, can I grab your chest ? And quat. It sounded even worse out loud than it did in his head. There was never a time in Izuku's life where he knew he sounded that pathetic, minus that meeting with All Might on the roof. At this point he almost wanted to be hit for requesting something so vulgar, but to his surprise Himiko didn't have a look of anger about her. In fact she looked deep in thought. Soon a grin crossed her face, one that was exact in every way to the strange joy she had when they fought. Quickly the bokken went to her right side as one hand held it before the handle was tossed up in the air and caught. Somebody's learning and quat, she said in a sing-song manner that made Izuku both cringe and hope. A finger was raised in a wagging fashion that hinted at some demeaning thing from how she held it. If you just tried without asking, then I would have had to punish you. But since you ask like a good boy, I think I'll allow it. Heck, you can even suck on him whenever you want. It's your reward for being so good for so long. And quat. Instantly Izuku's eyes became the size of saucers and his heart skipped a beat. This was actually happening? He was going to get what he wanted? He wasn't being rejected? He took a step forward, feeling more motivated to win than ever before in his life. The only way he could think to describe this sensation was akin to being a raging bull, and he loved it. But Himiko wagged another finger at him. Nuh-uh, you don't get that unless you win the game. Otherwise I get to whack you over and over with this thing until you do or you give up. And quat. Everything inside Izuku screamed at him to charge, to use his superior size and muscle to brute force his way to winning. But he took a step back and exhaled, feeling less blinded by his testosterone as he stared at the woman. You sure you're okay with this? Because my dumbass knows I'll take it too far and might hurt you. And quat. She grinned with every ounce of meek slyness as her fangs were bared in a wide smile while the wooden sword hung loosely at her right. Oh, I'm more than okay with it, but I see your point. How about we make a tap word? Something either of us can say when things get too rough to stop the fun. How about, pineapple ? And quat. Izuku raised an eyebrow, becoming slightly off-putted by how much she seemed to be into this idea. Pineapple ? And quat. She nodded, flipping the piece around in her hand. Yep, pineapple. You say that and I'll stop hitting. But you also lose the game and the reward. So if you really want what you say you want, then you're gonna need to endure a bit of pain. And quat. Quickly her smile faded and she put her hands forward as if to discount what she said. But, if you really do need to stop or if I go overboard, then say it. We can try again if you really do get hurt. I won't accept it if you just bitch out due to discomfort though. And quat. This was beginning to sound a lot like something other than martial arts training, and Izuku didn't know if he liked that or not. Still he pursed his lips once more and put an unconscious hand over his crotch. Alright, but you aren't going to hit me in the balls, are you? Because I can't handle that sort of pain. And quat. Himiko shook her head solemnly. I give you my word I won't. I'll just hit your upper torso and the outside of your legs. Deal ? And quat. He nodded, removing the hand from his groin and taking up a fighting stance when a thought popped into his head that made him smirk. Deal, but I'm wondering, since I get to grope and suck your tits, what exactly do I need to do to get permission to eat you out? Cause I can see that being a great stress reliever after a hard day. And quat. She glared at him with more edge than before, like he had insulted her or crossed a line he shouldn't have. Don't push it. Now, repeat after me. Pineapple. And quat. He recoiled a little at the harshness of her tone, but complied. Pineapple. And quat. She followed suit. Pineapple. And quat. He copied it again. Pineapple. And quat. Himiko repeated once more for remembrance's sake. Pineapple. And quat. Izuku finished the line and loosened his stance. Pineapple. And quat. The blonde lowered her weapon with an undeniable glee in her. She was going to enjoy this, every last second of it. Her breath got hot and she saw the need in him, the desire to win that she wanted to nurture and grow by choking and pushing it enough that it swelled like a fire. Even still was the fact that it was because of her that he was doing this in the first place. He wanted to touch her like it was some high trophy worth the pain of getting abused. Despite her therapy teaching her that she had value as a human being, it made her flood with joy at the thought of being desired by someone who wasn't insane. Part of her wanted to tease and flaunt herself more to him, to show just enough to have him entranced and wanting while keeping her dignity. Yet another part of her wanted to recoil and hide from the chance he might reject her for her tastes. Regardless, if she was allowed to exercise some of her more sadistic tendencies without being abandoned or in prison, then she'd take it. It wasn't like anyone else would want to deal with this for such a worthless prize after all. Steadily her grip on the handle tightened and she gave a predator's glint. Himiko watched Izuku respond with an adorable tenseness of his body while he was determined to win as only a man can when pleasure was on the line. Ready ? And quat. She said with a far more eager frill to her tone as the stave was moved to the middle guard. He paused for a second, apprehension coloring him for all of 5 seconds before he stared at her golden eyes and the smile under them. He took in the whole of her body and felt the long, cold sting of his loneliness. He knew this was not how normal people acted, but he was a reject and she was an outcast, so this was good enough. Besides, Izuku couldn't ignore the tingle at the base of his skull that came with the prospect of winning. He will be physically better and get rewarded for once with something other than money. Then this could open up a whole new world of possibilities. It was then he knew he shared the glint in her eyes. Ready. And quat. In less than a heartbeat, Himiko lunged forward with the bokken, stabbing with the point at his stomach, which would have knocked the wind out of him if Izuku hadn't dodged to the left. He avoided the stab and made to grab the weapon since it was blunt to the touch, yet she expected this and rolled her arms back to deliver a chop with the upper part of the blade to his lower leg, which hit a pressure point and made him yelp. She struck him hard to the sides, striking to the area around his ribs likely 4 times each if she had the mind to count. Izuku was defenseless against the sheer speed Himiko attacked at, but he persevered for both his hallowed prize and a burning sense of pride to not surrender to the woman. She raised the bokken over her head to strike down near his left shoulder, but right as it began to descend, Izuku sprang up like a rabbit with his arm extended. The weapon was now in his iron-like grip, and it was then the difference in physical strength became apparent when he moved her, not to the sofa which would have won the game, but to the wall a few feet behind her. Himiko held on to the wooden object when her back made contact with the wall and stared up at the man pinning her to it. He had a look of joy about him, not a secret arousal at such things, but more of a man enjoying a game with someone he cared for. His teeth were bared in a grin and he spoke in an almost flirty tone that didn't really fit his persona of a straight-laced, goody-goody. Seems like I'll be making the rules now. And quat. Without a thought, Himiko released the weapon, allowing it to remain suspended in the air by his grip, and ducked down to deliver a knee sweep with one of her legs, causing Izuku to tumble down and hit the floor. He landed with a hard thud. That was followed by Himiko climbing on top and throwing an elbow right to his solar plexus. The bokken fell out of his hand as the wind left him, leaving the girl to scoop up the tool and put the point right on his windpipe. However, Izuku grabbed the tip of the sword and rolled away to the left while pushing the object in the other direction, gaining enough distance between them to breath. He was huffing like he already winded as he held his belly. Himiko had lost some of her smile and devolved into a nearly cold professionalism before grinning at his performance. Looks like I'll still be making the rules around here, Greenie. Gotta say though, you've really improved since we first fought. Color me proud, baby boy. I think you might just deserve your reward. And quat. The sword slapped loudly in her hand as the flat hit against her palm. But, you still need to earn it. And quat. Looking up, Izuku felt forced to smile as he watched her. There came a tenderness to him that wasn't good for the setting, but he did anyway. His hands were loose and his body wide open as he walked forward. Then I'm all for that. And quat. A stab came instantly as he departed from the wall that Himiko shot directly at his belly. Izuku stepped to the side once more and broke into a run, putting all his weight ahead of him, only to have the woman slide to the floor and whack him above the feet in a slashing motion. He tripped again, hitting the floor as Himiko dove in for what would be a killing blow. So in one swift motion, he launched himself upright with his arms to either side and grabbed her in a bear hug while the point was sticking out of the space below his left armpit. He acted on instinct, sweeping her up before she could bite or kick, and slammed her petite frame on the sofa, ending the game in his favor as he breathed like he ran a marathon. Himiko looked up at him confused, before she realized the feel of the old leather. Blinking, she stared up at him with disbelief at the fact he won the first time around. Did you really want to feel me up that badly? And quat. He grinned and plopped himself down next to her, enwrapping her in a hug despite the many painful bruises on his body. More than you could believe. And quat. She was silent for a good 5 minutes after that. Sighing in defeat, she undid the straps to her bra and let it fall to the floor, exposing the black fabric to the world as she leaned into him. Fine, I gave my word. Just don't be creepy about it, alright? And quat. Izuku grinned at his triumph, but didn't reach in. Instead he squeezed her more and threw his back to the seat cushions, lifting her up in the air. A hand caressed her back and before long one caressed his as he continued to squirm to inch a little closer. Himiko didn't scowl at him, she merely rolled her eyes at the look of happiness he had upon getting to cuddle. Then Izuku stopped suddenly and managed to stand up with her still wrapped around him. His arms supported her like she weighed nothing, and to his credit, the woman only weighed 110 pounds. He looked at her with another gleam of hope as he stood above the couch. Do you mind if we do this in your bedroom since the springs hurt my back? And quat. She shook her head at his request, finding him to be more hopeless by the minute. Fine, just don't break my shit. And quat. Izuku smiled the silliest looking grin Himiko had ever seen and carried her off without another word, laying her down on the red sheets of her king-sized mattress before moving to turn the lights off and climb in himself. The room was a plethora of martial arts weapons tacked to the walls and bad movie posters, some cheesy and some horrifying. It had a blacked-out window to the left of the bed that rested above an overflowing clothes hamper, while the right side of the room had a closet blocked off by the door. It was the only room in the whole apartment painted a different color, which happened to be a bloody, dark red. Yet for Izuku none of this mattered as he brought a comforter over him and the girl this room belonged to. The only thing he wanted was to hold her until he fell asleep, and to his delight Himiko merely chuckled and let him have his way. He grabbed her, running his hands up her back as they became entangled. Her legs locked behind him and he twisted and turned until they got a comfortable position. Eventually he felt her back touch up to his chest, so he put a hand across her belly and one right under her chest, only to have her move his hand inside her shirt and around one of her breasts. "Enjoy it, Greenie, you earned it. Unquote," she said with her voice echoing out into the darkness. Izuku smirked at her tone, letting his fingers sink in for a few seconds before relaxing his body and closing his eyes. "I will. Good night, Himiko." Unquote. The room was silent for a heartbeat as the two began to quickly fall asleep in the warmth of each other's arms. At last Himiko surrendered to her drowsiness, finding herself a little upset that he didn't take more advantage of the opportunity as her eyes finally closed for the night. She was glad for the physical contact with someone she trusted more than anyone else who might have shared such an intimate moment with her before. She knew she enjoyed feeling him touch her so gently. It made her feel good in a way nothing had for a long time. But it was just that, touching. If he got a kick out of feeling her boobs or sucking them potentially, then so be it. Her chastity was still intact and that was still hers. Running a hand up the arm stuck in her shirt, Himiko relaxed in the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone for the time being and had someone else she could trust to not hurt her. It was the most she could hope for now, since all that was left was to keep moving forward. Good night, Zuzu. Unquote. Thanks for watching to the end of the video. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next part.